think I will begin. Hello and welcome. My name is Anne-Marie Buzatu and I'm a senior advisor to ICT4Peace. I'm really pleased to be here today to take part in this online conversation on peace processes after a pandemic, what role for technology. And while I know this crowd is certainly aware of the growing impact and importance of digital technologies on mediation and peace processes, the current pandemic has thrown into sharp relief the need for these technologies and actually shown that in many cases they can be quite effective. This begs the question of how these technologies can be further used, shaped, and developed for peace processes, particularly as we're looking forward to this still somewhat nebulous new normal where face-to-face meetings and travel may be much less common. This event is held under the auspices of the Cyber Mediation Network and was led and organized by ICT4Peace with excellent contribution from Build Up. In fact, this fruitful collaboration is the first in which ICT4Peace has participated as a core member of this network, and we are definitely looking to many, many more. And on that note, I'd like to pass the floor to ICT4Peace President Daniel Stauffacher, who will say a few words. Daniel?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks so much. It's really a great pleasure for me on behalf of Sanjana and Anne-Marie to welcome you also on behalf of ICT4Peace to this very important event. It's our first event as part of the mediation network. We have already worked with the network in a previous configuration, and we're very proud about that. Jonathan asked me to say a few words about ICT4Peace, but most of you know, just to say that we go back to 2004, 2006, where Sanjana and I really launched this idea and worked together ever since, especially in beginning in the field of how to use technology for peace building in its broadest sense. And we worked with the United Nations system, the family, to build the first information management, technology information system and strategy of the Secretary General, sorry. So I'm very happy to be with him and also with Anne-Marie. Sanjana, as you know, has been not only experimenting, but working and using technology in mediation in his own country in the peace process, and at that time sponsored by the Swiss government. And Anne-Marie, she has been working in Geneva for many years, specifically recently a big project for the Swiss government on the Montreux document on how to govern security companies, private security companies who are operative in conflict zones. Anyway, with that, I wanted to conclude. I would like to welcome also very much and thank Helena. With Helena and her colleagues and with Build Peace, we have a long cooperation. We were very proud to host you in Zurich at ETH, and Sanjana was speaking at MIT and with you. So this is great that you could join us. So with that, I thank you all and thank Jonathan and Enrico for their hospitality, and looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Now turning to the main event of the day, I'd just like to briefly introduce our participants, starting with Sanjana Hattotuwa, who is a special advisor to ICT4Peace. He is going to say a few words. He's going to give a presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction, Sanj, though. So since you have been working with ICT4Peace since 2006 and working in the role of using ICTs in crisis information management and peacekeeping initiatives, also a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives, where you've been overseeing the work of the center's pioneering civic media unit, and a fellow of the Center for Information Technology and Dispute Resolution at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. where you've also worked in a really practical way with the practical implementation of online dispute resolution and focusing on how web and mobile technologies can strengthen ethno-political and conflict transformation. And then also in this conversation is Helena Puig, who is a co-founder of, co-founder and director of Build Up, a nonprofit that is working to identify and applying innovative practices to prevent conflict and tackle polarization. You've worked in governance and peace building with over a decade of experience advising and supporting UN agencies, multilateral organizations, and NGOs, working in conflict contexts and polarized environments. You specialize in the integration of digital technology and innovation processes to peace processes and have written extensively on the subject matter. So with that, a couple more words about the format of this conversation. We will begin with a presentation by Sanj that will last about 30-35 minutes. This will be followed by a response by and conversation with Helena. And also as a note, we want to make this conversation interactive. So throughout the presentations, please put your questions and comments in the comments space on Zoom so that, and we'll try to follow it. I'll try to follow so that we can address it as we go forward. And with that, and with no further ado, I pass the floor to Sanj. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Trust everybody can hear me. Thank you for that kind introduction. Also, just to remind the participants that the presentation bit and the conversation with Helena and I will be recorded, but I will stop the recording at the point of time when the discussion starts so that the questions and answers can be in an environment that is, to the extent possible in the digital space, as close to as possible to the Chatham House rule, so that people are more comfortable opening up and we are more comfortable responding to the questions posed as well. So I want to share a few thoughts. This is not so much a presentation as it is, in a sense, a start for a conversation that I hope we can have in the limited time that we have today, but also moving forward. It's a conversation that I've been having with colleagues at the foundation, and I'm sure Helena is having at Build Peace, and so many of us are having around the world with respect to what we do wherever we are, as parents and caregivers or as professionals working in whatever institutions we are working in, around what to do now that the reality of the pandemic is with us and in the world that the pandemic has left behind. I did another presentation for UN Peacekeeping about a month ago that has some implications for the United Nations architecture, so I won't cover that terrain again, but I thought I'll share some thoughts I have also anchored to nearly 20 years of working in this field around what it means today to be working in technology and peace building, and what as a consequence we will have to change and become after the pandemic. So I started work in Sri Lanka close upon 15 years ago, if not longer, where I was the chief architect, the chief technology architect for a mediation and negotiations platform led at the time by Norway and the then government of Sri Lanka and the then armed terrorist group and its proxies and representatives. I wasn't involved in the nitty-gritty and substantive matters of the negotiation, but these are some screenshots of a platform called Groove Virtual Office that at the time powered these negotiations. And all of the negotiators were on this one platform. Of course, this was before social media. Facebook and Twitter weren't invented, and the smartphone wasn't a thing. You had what you now call dumb phones, but at the time they were just called phones. And nearly 2 decades ago, we had GIS, we had multilingual encrypted platforms where track 3, track 2.5, and track 1 participated in different workspaces around the issues that at the time were central to carving out, fleshing out, concretizing, and imagining a ceasefire agreement in the country. And we had, I won't go into it in too much of detail, also because there's a video on the platform that I created many, many moons ago that takes you through what the platform was. But just to say that this wasn't a platform just for the upper echelons of the mediation process. It was a way in which it was architected such that the grassroots and civil society organizations at the grassroots, through a way in which they could feed in to the process, also fed in what the people were thinking and believing in and perceiving and wanted, and their anxieties and their hopes and aspirations at the time, such that the negotiators at the table would also be sensitive to that. At least that was the hope and expectation. And there was also on the upper right, at least on my screen, the workspace which I curated, which was a compilation of a near real-time capture of the public reportage of the ceasefire agreement and news media reports, so that the negotiators could also be aware of how what they were saying was being captured by the mainstream media. This is a screen of the one-text mediation process. The mediators amongst you would know this. This was, as I said, led by a third party, in this case, mediators from a European country. But what we did was to create this space so that the people who were from these different political parties or representative groups could put in content, and it would then form the basis around which the mediation process could be structured. There was actually much more to this. There was a way in which you could even do very rudimentary, remember this is 20 years ago, so computing power and AI and ML, I mean, those weren't acronyms that were used, but there was a way in which you could get an idea of the resistance to a particular thing that was tabled by a particular party before it was discussed in the official negotiation. So just by virtue of sharing it. This was actually quite cool. It had never been done before. I've lost count of the number of times this has been now incorporated into doctoral level and master's level academic studies and theses, looking at online negotiation as, in a sense, ahead of the time, ahead of the curve. And as Daniel very kindly mentioned, though historically inaccurate, he started the foundation and very kindly invited me to join it several years after. And we call it now ICT4Peace, also because of the moniker of the foundation. But something that I really want to mention is that, and I think, Helena, you'll agree with me, is that before we coined the term and the phrase and the definitional parameters for what we now call ICT4Peace, these were things that people on the ground were using anyway, as a means of negotiating existential risks and concerns and challenges as a consequence of living or surviving within cycles of violence that they just don't call ICT4Peace. We call it that. They just call it trying to live in the middle of war, even today. And so when I look back at 20 years of what we call, from our privileged positions, ICT4Peace, these are some of the tools and platforms and apps and services and methods that I've used to capture inconvenient truths. And that really is it. A lot of narratives and stories in conflict is at the end of the conflict or war written by the victor, or during cycles of violence is violently marginalized or violently erased, or shut off or shut down or put to the periphery. And so all of what I've done and continue to do and advocate for and try to strengthen, even during my doctoral research here in New Zealand, is to use these tools, which are all public, none of them are proprietary, none of them I've developed myself, but to use them in ways to tell stories that would otherwise be untold. And that has been very, very powerful. And that in itself can be a lecture, but this is something that I've got my hands dirty doing. And that's also the other point that I want to make. A number of conversations I've had now with people in the West study this as an academic would. And there is merit to that. But there's also a difference in studying conflict from Geneva, Zurich, or the West, and living in conflict and responding to it. It is that difference that some of us try to bridge as well. And I know Helena does this through Build Peace as well. And so, a lot of what I want to talk about is not really about, I will end up talking about technology, but there is a conversation here that needs to be grounded in the culture and the grounded realities and context of the countries and contexts and communities and cultures that we work in. So even though we are talking about ICT for peace, information communications technology, what I always say is that the tech is secondary to what you want to achieve. And that, surprisingly, in 22 seems to be new to certain people who continue to come at me with solutions they have for a problem they want to see solved with the solution they have. And so that doesn't always quite work. So as I said, the conversation really is about the negotiation of everyday violence. A lot of this needs to be appreciated through political, gendered, grounded, contextual perspectives. What works in Africa as a continent will not work in South Asia as a continent. What works in Ethiopia and Somalia will not work in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. And so, these are really hard conversations to have because there's no one easy quick fix or one platform or service or app or tool or even methodology or approach that really works across geographies and across time. Some of the challenges I think that some of us consider to be new are, for some of us who have been working in this for quite some time, actually not that new and have existed before the COVID-19 pandemic as well. This image is from Sri Lanka, and the country has for a number of years an issue with militant Buddhism, which seems oxymoronic. I won't go into the history of it, but the first response I guess from many in the West is Buddhism is a religion of peace, so how on earth can you call a monk violent? It doesn't seem to go with what we know of the religion. And yes, that's true, but when religion becomes politicized and used for the purposes of partisan propaganda or for politics, then it becomes very contradistinct from the teachings of the Buddha. And so the country has been grappling with militant Buddhism for a while. And what's really interesting, and not unlike Myanmar, again, as Helena knows, as a consequence of Build Peace working there, is that the finest architects, ironically, of social media and its production and its promotion and its engagement and the shaping of it for propaganda are what I suppose in the West you would call right-wing extremism or right-wing extremists. And in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, you have Theravada Buddhism being weaponized by individuals such as the individuals you see up on the screen there through social media to further their own ends. So there's a really interesting problem space or landscape around how they are perceived, how they want to be perceived, how they use the technology. And I suppose for peace builders, how on earth you manage to include entities like this? I know my background, again, 15 years ago when I was doing my master's, is about inclusive peace processes. I suppose as mediators, none of us like to exclude people. I'll talk about that a bit more, but right now what social media has done is that it has really problematized the degree to which, how you do it, why you do it, and around whom you do it with, the politics of inclusion and exclusion. And as I said, this is, again, something that we can talk about at much greater length. Again, I mean, this man is symbolic for a variety of reasons, but he's not the only one. You have Bolsonaro, Duterte, Erdogan, my country's own president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. You have now the nexus between populism, authoritarianism, and the what in academia you call the bully pulpits of social media. So you have this morphing and merging and marriage of the power, the amplification of social media platforms and men and women of this nature who use it to promote their own agenda And very often it is a divisive agenda, it is a racist agenda. But the problem here is that, at least, I mean, there are many problems. One of the things that I'm doing in doctoral research is that the amplification effect is actually quite complex. So it's easy to see Trump as the problem. In fact, he's a symptom of a larger problem. And even if you take Trump away, the problems around the nature, the scale, the scope, the speed, the generation, the fluidity, the engagement, the expansion, the amplification, the cross-domain fertilization, and a range of other problems around the media landscape that we face today, with the political culture that we face today, maybe not in New Zealand, and certainly may not be here in Switzerland or New Zealand, but in many other parts of the world, you have a rise in authoritarianism, India included. And even if you take the populists and authoritarians away, the political culture enmeshed now with the power and the ubiquity of social media platforms is creating problems that we haven't seen before, and certainly predated the pandemic. And again, some of this is on account of individuals like Mark Zuckerberg and the nature of corporate entities that now we share our lives on. Facebook knows more about me than I suppose my parents did, or certainly my friends do. And there's a whole discussion to be had around what are called black box algorithms. None of us know how they curate the news for us, how what is presented for us is selected for us, and intermediary liability. I know that Section 230, the law, is being debated as we speak because of Trump's pushback to what Jack Dorsey did with Twitter. But these are ongoing conversations. And to put simply, the sheer degree to which our worldview today is informed by what we see through the palms of our hands, or what's in the palms of our hands, or through the devices that we use, or the screens that we are glued to, is extraordinary. There's a whole school of media theory that looks into persuasion and pervasive design, where the currency that is, or the commodity today, is attention. And it's attention seeking and attention retention that's going into a lot of these platforms. And that's not a good thing, because it's always corrosive and divisive, and the worst kind of content that seems to be shared the most. The other thing that's kind of interrelated to that, and I try to use the analogy or this moving image of a forest, is that when we walk through, and I'm sure that many Europeans, as I do now in New Zealand, have the pleasure of walking through wonderful areas that are, with forest cover as often as we can, is that, when you look at the ground, you see only certain spaces that are lit up by the sunlight, because you have the branches and the leaves blocking out the sunlight, and you don't know how that's happening. You don't always look up. You can't go above the tree line to see the sun, and so what you're left with is a landscape that's lit and also unlit, that's light and that's dark. And I try to use this as a visual aid to kind of help us understand the media landscape that we're dealing with, where, to put simply, one of the challenges that we face today in America, in Europe, across the Atlantic, in New Zealand, and certainly in countries like Sri Lanka, is that there is no common narrative anymore. When I was small, we used to gather around the television at 8 o'clock as a family to look at the news. Nobody does that anymore, at all. There is the 8 o'clock news, but nobody watches it at 8 o'clock. You watch it at 8:30 or 9 o'clock or the next day. And you watch it in smaller segments. You comment on it. It's a social viewing. And so you tend to believe and think about and be bounded by and hostage to what you consume and what is presented to you. So when I talk about Sri Lanka, there's really sometimes no connection with others who have a very different media diet to mine. And so it's very, very difficult for peace builders to kind of find a common narrative, leave aside a shared history, or a common future. We can't even agree on the present. So how on earth can we create the foundations and ground for the future? And this is encompassed in data science as well. This is a fairly popular slide around how at the time of Brexit, you had just on one platform, Twitter, this complete bifurcation of perspectives and individuals from those who wanted to support Brexit and those who wanted to remain. And this is actually quite new insofar as the division between these two camps is very much the case in the United States with the Republicans and Democrats. And I think Bill Peace is doing some super cool work over in the States around just this issue of radical polarization. Now, what's happened to us after the pandemic? And again, it really depends on who you talk to and where they're located in. The situation for Helena in Spain is different to Daniel in Zurich, is different to Switzerland, is different to Melbourne in Australia, is different to me here in Dunedin in New Zealand, is different to my mother who's back home in Sri Lanka. So I don't claim to know what everybody is going through. And this is not a claim, certainly in the time that I have, to be comprehensive around what the world is facing, but some broad brushstrokes. For those of us from a certain age, and those of us who love the Muppet Show, this is pretty much how I see all of you right now on Zoom. And the idea is not mine, but somebody made the analogy that our lives after the pandemic look like the introduction sequence to the Muppet Show. We have all these windows of individuals that you don't really have a connection to. I see Anne-Marie looking away. Is she bored? I don't know. I see Daniel scratching his head. Is he bored? I don't know. I don't know what you guys are thinking. And there's actual cognitive science that suggests that right now, all of us are going through a brain taxation that is by order of magnitude greater than if we were to have this conversation in real life, person to person. This has a profound implication on how we interact, because online interaction is very different. And our brains are constantly trying to fill in gaps of the disconnect between frame and sound, and also the strangeness of seeing individuals in this manner. And there's actually robust science behind this. So if this is the way that we are going to interact as humans for the foreseeable future, then that has implications for processes we are already part of, and for fragile processes that we have been curating, that have been bounded to, or being anchored or founded around face-to-face negotiations or face-to-face interactions. Some of that is not going to be able to be replicated online, even through video conferencing. Some of what we are going to have to deal with is called complex media ecologies. This is actually a beautiful photo. I couldn't believe it was true, but it is true. It's of a river delta in some Scandinavian region. And a lot of, I mean, when I'm writing up my thesis, I always make these analogies to nature because people find it very easy to understand. And when you look at, as I do, social media, you don't look at it in terms of one app or platform. You look at it in terms of an ecology, like the wetlands or a forest or even an urban ecology. Everything is interconnected with each other. And the problem, well, one of the problems is that it's really hard now to determine what's true and where it came from. Who said it? Who said it first? How did it come to me? How is it creating a problem? Why are people talking about this? Is it true? And it might have started in one location through a tweet that goes to YouTube, that is reflected on Facebook, that is reported on TV, that a clip of which goes viral on WhatsApp, that somebody then tweets about. Seeing that tweet, somebody blogs about it, somebody comments on that blog, that comment becomes a Facebook post, and the Facebook post's comments that are generated as a consequence are picked up by a politician and uttered in a national level parliament. So these are really, really complex ecologies. And so it's very difficult to deal with this kind of world today. And Helena, you wanted me to also talk about the power of stories, where the challenge is that all of us are surrounded by stories. And I'm kind of making a visual play, at least it works in English, I don't know whether it works in other languages, between stories insofar as the stories of a building, which is a hierarchy. You would tend to believe those in certain positions of authority and political authority more than you would tend to believe some others. And on the other side of the screen, stories, which is about the grassroots and the stories people have that are sometimes fundamentally more important than the stories that the politicians want people to hear, sitting where they do because it's convenient for them. So one of the challenges that we have today, again, even if we are just individual consumers of the media landscape, is how on earth do we hone in on what's important to us? Because every day, the moment that we turn on our phones, it's a tsunami of competing narratives, all of which appear to be the same, at least of the same kind of importance, that we need to sift and select, which is very, very different to, at least, I think that gives away my age, the media landscape that I grew up with in Sri Lanka, where you only had 2 channels and the television. And one of the implications of this is actually what's happening right now. So the lady that you see up there, Kamala Harris, it's really interesting, seems to be interested in revising her political history on Wikipedia. And this is a challenge that we are going to have around the veracity of content, even through sources and platforms that we would consider to be authoritative or somewhat authoritative. And so this is called a Wikipedia war. I've seen so many occasions that this has happened in Sri Lanka as well. And the point of the matter is that you get a few individuals to make the Wikipedia entry kinder or more charitable to what you want to be or project at that point of time, which means that you have to do significant edits. But the problem with Wikipedia, or the great benefit of Wikipedia, is you see all those edits. So you can see who's changing it and you can see what's changed. But people who don't know this, and many people don't, would tend to believe only the most recent version of whatever entry that is up there. And this is, in a sense, symbolic of the challenge we have around veracity on social media, connected to my good friend in the Philippines, who's now targeted by Duterte. And the manner in which she's targeted, Maria Reza is targeted, is through trolls and algorithms and the usurpation of social media by individuals who are hidden behind a cloak of pseudonymity or anonymity to direct content against her. And it's really, really bad. It's really vicious. She fears for her life. And as some of you may know, she was recently convicted on the most farcical of grounds, and it is unclear what her future in the Philippines is going to be. But the court case and proceedings aside, what she has to face as a consequence of the onslaught of attacks over social media is certainly not something that is alien to me, and I'm sure to Helena and many others around the world. Given the network I'm talking to, I think you guys really like the Chatham House rule, this cloistered environment where old men, and it's usually old men, determine the future of a particular context or a country. I cannot imagine something like Stormont Castle and the Belfast Agreement happening in the way that it did back in the day, today in 2020. And the concept is called radical transparency because everything is now porous. And even if the room is, without any kind of signals coming in and you have to give up all your smartphones when you're going in, information will still leak out. And so the conduct of peace negotiations or peace processes is really, really difficult today. Not impossible, but really, really difficult. So I kind of asked the question publicly before as well, what does it mean to have the Chatham House rule in 2020? Is it senseless in a sense to call it such? And then, as I said, this goes back to the kinds of conversations that we have on social media, which we don't realize are actually usually generated by a privileged few, like me. I'm a privileged person from Sri Lanka. I speak English, I'm in New Zealand, and that makes me a minuscule percentage of the population. So I do not claim to, and I certainly do not represent my country. But when you look at social media, you tend to believe what is there, not realizing that the content is actually created by a limited number of people. So what does it mean to have representation and authenticity? Who is participating? And importantly, who is left out. A couple of final thoughts. I know that some of you, at least I was told, are interested in AI and machine learning. And I think some of the challenges are what in the UN language is called frontier, but is going to soon be front door issues. So this is a video I recorded for this presentation. This is completely machine-generated text. Up until a few months ago, this was the most advanced ML text processing platform, AI platform that was around. You can see that depending on what I put, it's either very good or either very bad, because it's taking and it's generating the text based on the input that the AI and the machine learning has had to learn English. And hilariously, it struggles the most with that sentence, Trump is the best president. So even AI struggles with Trump. But all of what you're seeing here is generated in real time. This kind of thing didn't exist a few years ago. And if you think this is indicative of the state of the art, and you convince yourself looking at this video that you'll never be fooled by anything that is written by a machine or an algorithm, this is the state of the art right now. It's called the GPT-3 model. It's not in the public domain. I can talk a lot about this. It costs $12 million to create. And it's the most advanced text generation that we have today, anchored to 175 billion inputs. And there's an academic paper by the creators of it that suggests that we've hit the limits of this kind of language modeling. But what's really important is what I've highlighted there, and that's either fascinating or frightening. Usually people in the UN find this frightening. Usually people from civil society and others like myself find it a combination of both fascinating and frightening. We have now hit a point where it's really hard to determine whether text was generated using GPT-3 by a machine or not. And the hardest that humans found to say whether it was determined, whether it was created by a machine or not, was what you see up there. This was actually created by GPT-3, but 50% of those who were asked whether this was human or machine said that it was human generated. And this is still embryonic technology, even though we might have hit the ceiling in terms of how GPT-3 works with its model. That doesn't mean that the research isn't ongoing around other models and even more persuasive text generation. And so a lot of us talk about deep fakes. So I thought of talking about deep fakes, but using another lens. This is a recent New York Times article that some of you may have read. So a lot of us talk about the weaponization potential of it. This is a documentary filmmaker from Chechnya who has made a film where he wanted to, for the purposes of protecting those in it, hide or disguise the faces of the people in the documentary. And so what he did was he did deep fakes. All of the images, all of the people in this documentary are, in that sense, deep fake generated. And it's created this entirely new conversation around the generative users and perhaps abusers of deep fakes, but more in the documentary world. And also in this case, what you would call a pro-social use case, where it's actually used to protect individuals as opposed to spread propaganda or harm. But in my part of the world, and Helena, you can also comment on this, it's not, I mean, the West is so interested in deep fakes, whereas in my part of the world is actually what you call shallow fakes. The image on the left is actually me and a parliamentarian. This was an interview that I did for public television about 12 years ago, but it's it's been reworked and dubbed over in my language, so I can't play it back because it won't make sense to any of you, to focus on what this parliamentarian's corruption is. But a lot of people who saw it thought that that dubbed version was the real version. And so, this is just one example using myself as a scapegoat, but, shallow fakes, which are obviously fake to you and I from a certain background and a certain level of education, ends up really fooling people. And that's a problem also with satire now, because it might be interpreted very differently to intent. So I don't want to end with doom and gloom. What are the opportunities that we have? I use the mantra of Black Lives Matter. One of the things that a lot of the discussions I find in the West need to do is to stop talking and start listening, and to observe what has been done and not think that you have the solutions to what are more creative innovations from the field on the ground in ways that you can't even grasp or comprehend. So I think the first step is to stop believing that we have the solution and to start asking the question around how we can help. There are new orthodoxies that you don't want to question around technology and a normative tradition that is anchored in Western liberal notions and Western academia that I think we need to question as well. A friend of mine said that this was like parachuting academics who have a rapacious, extractive relationship with academics and practitioners on the ground in the global South. So I think that some of what we talk about in the West also has to change in terms of approach, thinking, thought, framework, analysis, and design. There are two professors who actually call it bullshit. They're coming out with a book next month. This is a very controversial, but now very, very popular graduate level program that they do in university. And now they're coming out with a book. The entire course, all of the lectures are online, and they actually called it Calling Bullshit. And this was a way in which they helped students and anybody who wants to follow that course deal with misinformation. And finally, I was told that some of you are interested in VR. And I'm not going to take a poll, if you haven't done VR and created a model and inhabited a VR world and tried on at least 5 different goggles and tried the technology, I would hesitate to suggest that you should be promoting this technology as a viable means that is globally applicable around the resolution or transformation of anything, leave aside violent conflict, which is point number 1. Point number 2 is that I started writing about this 15 years ago with Second Life. So this is not new. A lot of work has been done, but it might be new to people now who are suddenly waking up to this, and it becomes then the fashion trend du jour of 2020 and 2021. But I would strongly caution against the advocacy around this without examining what it entails, and frankly, going and trying it out. Some of your children may have these VR goggles. Go try it out and then see what it actually does. There's rich potential around augmented reality. This is from Google, which is very, very different to virtual reality. We can talk about it more if there are questions. But this is promising technology, and the UN seems to concur. They have launched this peace art project with AR. And my final slide is that, when we talk about technology, I always try to put myself in the shoes of those who are like this boy from in a city in India. And I wonder whether what I talk about, and I say, actually, this is actually a problem with my thesis, where I'm trying to communicate ideas and things that should be done that make his life and his dreams more within his grasp. And as I would like to end by saying that, it's not about the technology. Helena and I have a long history of talking about this, and I hope you also speak to this. It's about what you want to see as a consequence of using the technology, and not about the technology itself. So I'll end there. And Helena, maybe we can have some conversation.
Thank you, Sanj. I just would, before I pass to Helena, I just would like to remind people that you can post your comments in the comment space. I am trying to follow them, and we will do our best to address them if there are comments or questions in the course of these conversations. And with that, please, Helena, take it away.
You've already got 3 excellent questions in the chat, Sanj, that you might want to look at. I'm actually going to comment on something different to what's in those questions, and I'm not going to take up a lot of time just to give you the opportunity to actually address those questions. I really wanted to highlight 2 things that, having been in conversations in this network before, I think were new in the way that you framed, and particularly relevant to some of the conversations I've been hearing. One is the way that you talked about the complex ecology of digital media. And I really think understanding the complexity of this ecology is critical as people in mediation engage with digital media. The way that I sometimes think about it, which I think is complementary to a lot of what you were saying, is to understand that mediators need to look at digital media in the same way that as they look at the conflict context. So if you have analysts that provide context assessment when you enter a new conflict area, then you need digital analysts who will understand the complex ecology of digital media and its effects on the conflict that you're operating in. And so some of the things that you raised, I think are very pertinent to this view. So you talked, I think there's, you talked about the issue of sort of persuasive and pervasive design, attention retention, and the fragmentation of narrative and the effect that that has on our understanding of the world. And I think you've heard me say this before. I would take it a little bit further, and I would say it's not just our understanding of the world, it's actually our identity. The persuasive and pervasive design of technologies and the attention retention aspects of algorithms have an effect on the ways that we express and we experience our identity online. And I think increasingly we're seeing that it polarizes people into positions that are harder to move from. And the fragmentation of narratives makes it harder to construct any kind of a common identity. We see that a lot with national identities, right? And the continued disputation of national identities in digital media. So I think that's quite an interesting thing. And often in conversations about digital media, people working in peace building and peacemaking will say, okay, but how is that affecting offline, right? Can you link the rise in a conversation to an offline violent event? And I think that seldom is true. You can't draw such a direct line because you're in this delta of complex ecology. The actual way to approach this, to understand the offline effect, is to understand that the walls are becoming non-existent, that our online reality defines who we are, defines our identities and the way that we move in the world, and therefore is part of the conflict environment. So that was one thing that I wanted to highlight. The other thing that you said in discussing this complex ecology that I think is really interesting is this idea of the bifurcation of perspectives. You used the Twitter example from Brexit and Bremain, right? And those kinds of maps, we've seen them in a lot of places. And at Build Up, we've done some work on particular specific conflict conversations, right? So we've looked, for example, at refugee and host community narratives in Lebanon. So Syrian refugees and Lebanese host communities, and how that conversation looks. And again, the picture, if I had it, which I don't have right now, the picture of that Twitter sphere is very similar in the sense that it's also got this bifurcation of perspectives. And one of the things that we have been encouraging people working in peace building and peacemaking to do is to then map themselves onto that. Because typically, the UN and large peace building actors are only speaking to one sphere, which means that often there's a certain preaching to the choir. We did this very interestingly with Stonewall, which is an LGBT rights organization in the UK, when they were looking at the debate around trans rights, which had become incredibly polarized. And so we did a similar map, and I was fully expecting Stonewall to be very much in one camp. And what we discovered is that actually Stonewall and some of the staff at Stonewall were one of the few bridges in between the two sides of the polarized debate. And that put them in a very interesting position. So identifying who are these bridges in those polarized debates, I think is a critical kind of input to understanding your position in this complex context, right? So that was one thing. And then the other thing that I wanted to come back to is, you know, you're sort of like, what do we do? So knowing that this is the case, what do we do as peace builders? And I love that, as always, you kind of answer that question by saying, well, look at what is being done. And I just wanted to reinforce that point. There is so much that is being done already to strategically use digital technologies to build peace. But the critical issue in identifying those actors and what is being done is something that you said at the very beginning. This is the ICT4Peace Foundation. We call this ICT4Peace. I sometimes call it digital peace building. But a lot of the people that I interact with through the build-up networks that are in fact using technology to build peace don't think of this as ICT4Peace, and frankly, often don't call themselves peace builders. It's actually, in a way, paradoxically, it's one of the things that makes digital technology most inclusive. A lot of people who wouldn't typically think of themselves as working as peace builders or working as mediators are in fact carrying out those roles on digital technology. And that's something that I think we can continue to surface. So in some of the programs that we do, when we identify people who are using digital technologies to, what we would say, build peace, they say it's the first time that anyone ever says that that's what I'm doing. And there's a certain power in naming that and in calling it out and then elevating those experiences from the grassroots that I think is quite interesting in this space. So those were just my two main reactions to a lot of the very interesting things that you said. And I think you've got some other questions coming in through the chat that are super interesting as well.